Welcome to Bottomline Live on Metro TV. This is what we say, business at the speed of light. My name is Winston Taki, sitting for a regular host, Kusi Free. And tonight, we're going to be going through the history of Ghana's debt and also the structure, how far we've come, and also the state of the economy. As of now, there has been conversation all around and all year as to what is the true state of Ghana's economy. We've seen the case of e-levy being the debate in the House of Parliament, and also economists and analysts, some are saying back to IMF, others say, no, don't even try. These and more discussion we'll be having here tonight. And we have a surprise guest for you tonight also. And to probably tell you the truth, we're going to go through down the memory lane in regards to Ghana's economy. We'll take a break. When we come back, we'll go straight to the conversation. Welcome back to Bottomline Live on Metro TV. We're also streaming live on channel 227 on DSTV. Also, we are live on Facebook as well as Twitter. And also, if you go on our YouTube channel, go to Metro TV, and we also will be watching this discussion currently going on there. Tonight, we're going to be having a very interesting conversation, but my guest currently in the studio is in the person of Bright Simmons, who is the Vice President of Imani Africa. Okay, good evening, Mr. Bright.
Good evening, Winston. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So what's going on with Imani? It's been a while. We've had much report from your end.
Oh, we've been very active. We just recently launched the study that is supposed to help the government fix some of the loopholes and the gaps at the ports. Because, import duties are a significant chunk of the revenues that we make, in excess of $1 billion. And for quite a while now, which is actually more than we are hoping to get from e-levy. And for quite a while now, we've had challenges in terms of meeting the targets set for trade-related tariffs and other types of revenue. Imani has been looking very carefully at these matters and has been sharing its insights with the relevant authorities. So Imani has not been quiet at all.
So will we be expecting any public report to that effect anytime soon?
Yes, Imani has been publishing. Most recently, it's entered into this cocoa board analysis matter. And just as it's always done, it publishes its reports. I think it's the media that doesn't sometimes pay as much attention as they should. But as far as Imani is concerned, it's very much on track and is very committed to the issue of accountability and scrutiny of government policy.
Okay. We'll be coming back to you shortly. There's more tonight, and tonight we're going to see what you really have for our viewers on that.
It's a pleasure.
All right. So let's go to the World Bank. This week, the World Bank Country Director, Pierre Laporte, has been speaking with regards to the state of Ghana's economy. He made mention of the fact that there has been instances where many have attributed to our current state of the economy due to the impact of COVID-19. But he said the challenges existed before even the commencement of COVID. And also he made a point that we are actually in tough times, and so we have to prepare ourselves for the journey ahead. Let's take a listen to what he really said.
The right time isn't about whether you go or not. The right time is what kind of reforms are you ready to do? Because even if you're ready to, if you want the IMF, but you don't want to do the required reforms to address the issues that you have, IMF will not come. World Bank, I just mentioned earlier, we have budget support on the table that we're working with, talking to government. But when I go to my VP goes to the board to say, we want to give Ghana $203 million budget support. They will ask, let me see the reform package that you come with. And here we are not talking about conditionality, the way people used to think about conditionalities. It's more about how strong is your reforms to address the problem you have today. It's like you go to a doctor, he'll tell you when, what I see here, you need that. But if you want to take something else, then fine, but don't come to me. I said COVID caused a problem. I was very clear earlier that even prior to COVID, there were signs that, the debt was already at 60 plus, already above what you would consider moderate risk of debt distress. But COVID has certainly exacerbated the situation. That's a reality. But the answer is not, that COVID did it. The answer is we have a problem today. We need to bring down the deficit. The debt is very high. It's bordering non-sustainability and sustainability. So what are the actions government will take, bold actions, to restore that sustainability, to allow resumption of sustainable growth?
All right, so you've heard the country director of World Bank, Pierre Laporte, speaking with regards to the nation's economy. He made mention of the fact that the government should be transparent with regards to the real figures and also the state of the economy. But here with me in the studio is Bryce Simon, the Vice President of Imani Africa. So what do you actually make of this pronouncement from the World Bank country director?
I think he was being diplomatic, but in the course of being diplomatic, still making it quite clear that as far as they're concerned, business as usual is not the appropriate attitude to take to the current difficulties that the country has. We need a greater sense of urgency. We need a sense of crisis. And so far, the government has given the impression that this is a temporary blip, that everything was fine, we just had COVID, and there was a bit of a downturn, and in a few months or in a year or so, everything is going to be back to normal. But there are signs that perhaps this is the time for us to think of a very radical departure from the journey that we've been on, and that's exactly what I intend to take your viewers through tonight.
Okay, so we'll be going to the touch screen shortly, and certainly we'll be looking at the reality of the economy. Mr. Bright Simmons is going to take us through that journey, and that journey certainly will give you an enlightened view of what the reality is currently. So, Mr. Bright, the screen is yours, and we'd like to hear you take us through. So he'll be taking us through that analysis, and don't miss out, don't even take your eyes off the screen, because we are going to give you the narrative from the angle. I can see the topic already.
Yes.
Ghana's big Bamba crisis, the big Bamba. Hey.
Yes, and I'll explain why it's a big Bamba crisis in a minute. But let's be very clear about one fact.
Okay.
And that one fact is that we've been here before. In fact, we've been here several times, which is what makes it interesting. Because if I'm able to show, as I intend to do, that over the last couple of decades, we've had these recurrent crises, and that this is embedded into our economy, it's embedded in the structure of our economy, then the notion that this is some kind of temporary blip will be indefensible if we're able to show that somehow. So what you're looking at is a picture of President J. Kufuor, Mr. Bottomline, Mr. J.H. Mensah, and the Marquess of Lothian.
That was around which particular?
This is 1970, 1971. So there were a number of visits to London around something called the London Debt Conference in Marlborough House in the UK. So Ghana, even in 1970, was at a point where it was in serious economic crisis and could not pay its debts. In 1965, already it was very serious. Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah had approached the IMF. They were in the course of negotiating an agreement. He wasn't happy with some of the terms. And then in 1966, he was overthrown. When the new military government came in 1967, they did go to the IMF. Then there was a multilateral initiative. The different creditors came together to agree on a path out. They gave Ghana some degree of relief, even in 1967. Same happened in 1968. But by 1970, the argument of the Ghanaian state was that we still could not bear the burden. So in 1970, the British government was approached to host a multilateral creditor confab. So in essence, they brought the different creditors. And those days, a lot of our creditors were governments, other governments, West Germany, the UK, the US. So this was the first conference in Marlborough House. And the reason that President J. Kufuor was sent was because he was Deputy Foreign Minister, and Mr. J.H. Mensah was the Finance Minister.
Okay.
And if you see, the way that it was understood was that somehow the Nkrumah government had been too ambitious, had borrowed too much. Our debt had climbed to something in the region of about $6 billion. Now keep that figure in mind, $6 billion. And we could not, if the creditors refused to do something about it, we could not service those debts, meaning that we could not pay the principal as they fall due and the interest, the periodic interest associated with the debt. So the end game was that the creditors agreed with the government assessment that we needed relief, And what happened was about half of our debt was more or less wiped off.
So the relief journey did not just start.
No, not just with HIPC. No. So we had in 1971 a major attempt to restructure our debt, which led to a lot of the debts being reprofiled. So if you had a tenure of 10 years, they make it 30 years, they reduce the debt. The effect was to reduce our debt burden by about 47%. Then in 1974, we came back and we said, well, we couldn't really still pay the famous Yentua. So initially there was an uproar, and then eventually the Paris Club in particular, but other creditors as well, gave Ghana relief. And there also we saved about 47%. And remember that our debt had already been brought down to something like 3.3 billion. And by the time the military government, the NRC, succeeded in restructuring our debt again, we had additional relief. All the way till HIPC, which is the famous one. I'm not going to talk a lot about the 1982 one because 1982, those defaults were followed up rapidly with the whole structural adjustment program. So the first attempt that we had to say, look, it's not just about saying we can't pay, but if we say we can't pay, then we have to begin a journey to position us so we can pay our debts, or we don't have too much debt that they begin to choke us. So in 1983, there was that effort. Previously, we didn't have that luxury because, remember, the 1971 agreements were abrogated when the government was overthrown in 72. And then the military government was a socialist government, and its path to getting us out of this seeming dependency was to nationalize a lot of the assets. So the mines were nationalized, by which it meant that the country, the government, took more than half the ownership of all the strategic industries in Ghana. Now, that path was not very much aligned with the liberal international order at that time.
Was that a good move as a debt?
Well, the evidence suggested that even that was not enough. I mean, there can be a long ideological debate of whether or not the government should have the commanding heights and all that. We don't have the time for that. But what we know is that it didn't work. How it didn't work and why it didn't work, there are a lot of differences. So by 2003, we'd been through the first attempt to restructure the whole economy so we don't go back, which was the structural adjustment program, which ended sometime with the onset of democracy. It's about a decade of structural reform. But already, a decade thereafter, we're already back. So even the structural adjustment didn't work. And we are at a stage where Ghana had to go back to them and say, look, forgive us our debt, restructure the rest of it, else we cannot survive as an economy. So this is what we got. Of all the countries in the region, in Africa, that got this HIPC deal, Ghana got the second largest amount after Democratic Republic of Congo. You can see that, right? $6 billion of relief. That number again. So $6 billion of relief is what we got by going to HIPC. They more or less wiped away the debts we had accumulated. What that meant, because what we are talking about is the ability to pay your debts. When they fall due, when the principal falls due, so if you borrow 100,000, when the 100,000 is due, you have to pay, or you have to borrow to pay it off. And then every now and then you have to pay interest, periodic interest. So it's the combination of the two that creates the pressure, what we call the debt service pressure. Now the debt service is how much you pay to service your debt, how much you pay to your creditors periodically over a period of time. Now, often we try and see whether you have the ability to pay by measuring it with other measures of your economy. So one of the measures of your economy is the exports, because the exports give you foreign exchange. And if your debt is primarily in foreign currency, then you need foreign exchange to pay the debt. So we use your exports to have an indication of whether or not you have the foreign exchange to pay. It's not a perfect measure, because not all the things that you export for which the forex comes to the government, but it's a rough measure. The other one, which is obviously self-evident, is your revenue, the budget revenue, the money you raise in taxes, you raise in grants, royalties, etc. So if you look at it, in 2000 when we went to HIPC, this is from the Bank of Ghana. All these charts are from other researchers, to be clear. So by the time we hit 2000, just at the time when we're going to HIPC, we're spending, if we were to pay our debts, as and when they fall due, we'll have spent 80% of all our revenue paying debts. 80%. And 20-something% of all our exports revenue paying debt, because that's the external component.
I want to ask, would it be because we did not assess the risks involved in terms of the structure of our borrowing before we even engage with the international institutions?
It's expectation. We always go and say, we're going to change our economy this way. And if we change our economy this way, our revenue will be this way, growth will be this way, so our debt will have this particular effect. The question is, can you execute? When you go and make these promises. Because every time we go, we make promises. And it's the same with IMF, it's the same with e-levy. They are making promises. If you give us the e-levy, we'll do this, we'll do that. The question is whether or not we execute. So if you look here, what you are looking at, the red line, when it goes down, is the deficit. The deficit simply means that after you've collected the money that is reliable, taxes and the rest of it, and you compare it to your expenditure, there's a gap. That gap is what we call the deficit. If there's no gap and you have more, it's a surplus. So your fiscal deficit is the one that goes down like that. And you can see that the crisis periods are very clear. You have a crisis period in 1971 when we went there and did that debt situation. You can see that, right?
Yeah.
We had no crisis, no fiscal deficit. Because why? We went to restructure our debts, right? And then the government is overthrown. So we abrogate that arrangement. And then you see that spending patterns change because you go there and tell them, I'm going to be more disciplined. So what did we do? We devalued the currency. We started to sack some civil servants, Apollo 568, remember? All of those things were measures the government was trying to take to give an indication that it was restructuring. Then the government gets overthrown. A new government comes in and they start to spend like crazy, right? So you have all these fiscal debt, as much as 12%, around 75 when we had the crisis. At some point, there's another palace coup somewhere there. Things start to improve a little bit when the government start to get a handle, the new democratic government start to get a handle on matters, right? Okay. You can see that things are starting to improve a little bit in 79, thereabout. But then we have another crisis with the revolution. And then you can see that by the time that Dr. Kwesi Botwe and the moderates decided we're not going to go down this socialist path of high spending, government in charge, we're going to try and be more efficient as a country and the rest. They went into the economic reform program. And that is when you start to see the fiscal deficit situation improve. You see the way it went.
So, and within that period, what did they really do?
What did they do?
Yes.
Well, a number of critical things. One of them is often the currency. In these regimes, what they do is that they often control the currency by setting an arbitrary rate. They say it's maybe $1 should be 2.5 cedi. And then they stick to it. What that means is that if the black market has another price, which is the true price, let's say 7, then I have privileged access. I just go and take it from the government at 2.5. I go and sell it in the black market for 7 and make a good profit. But in so doing, I create scarcity, even more scarcity. Now, what then happens is in time, you start to defend the currency by putting in your foreign reserves into the market to try and stabilize. And if that is not working, it builds up additional pressure. Then you also have the situation where they simply do not rationalize their expenditure. So if you take, for instance, the argument that the NRC made, which was that they cannot do retrenchment, end of story. I mean, when they wrote to the IMF, they're like, we can't do retrenchment. We have a lot of workers. Some of them are in parks and gardens and other things where they are not adding as much value, but we can't sack workers. So if you can't sack workers, you have to keep paying them. Then you anticipate growth. If growth is not coming at a certain level, taxes will not also rise. And the more you take charge of the economy, the less private sector is available to engage in order for them to pay you tax. So you better be running those companies well. But you know the history of our state enterprises. A lot of losses, because it got to a point they could not replace spare parts in factories. So over time, you find that the government just not making enough money. And then you had this situation which then started to build up in the 90s when we went back to democracy. And some of the democratic impulses in our land has also meant that reform just stops. So as we are restructuring, democratic resistance build up. We have the most unionized public sector workforce in the whole continent. Almost 70-something% of all public sector workers are unionized.
Has he helped us in a way? Because
creating some stability in some areas, some degree of social harmony, so people complain a lot, but they don't go extreme, And we don't really have time to delve into a lot of that. But the truth is, as you can see, around 93, 94, thereabouts, we're already in crisis. We had another big crisis when the Asian financial crisis happened in 97, and then the power crisis in 98. I don't know if you remember. So they tend to come together, similar things. Then we had an inflation crisis, went to 40%. Then we had a huge additional spate of other types of pressures building up, like exchange rate and the rest, and each of them reinforce the other. They are what we call pro-cyclical. When one is happening, the other tends to go in the same direction. Until Ghana reached completion point at HIPC, when the new government decided that we're going to go and do HIPC, which was a no-brainer. But remember, there was a big debate in Ghana, why are they going to do HIPC? It made no sense, because you have debt, you can't pay the debt. The issue was always national pride, which Ghanaians are extremely proud about, the nation and what we think we can do. So anything that makes us look like we are not on top often gets resistance, which is part of why I say it's a big Bamba thing. Okay. We have this view that we have to chill with the big boys in that sense. Okay, then we had a bunch of crises that also start to come right after 2006. Part of this was the government deciding in 2006 that it was no longer going to have an IMF program. It was not going to follow on with restructuring and tighten the belt and those things. So this is more or less the journey of what we do. We go and promise restructuring, we get off lightly, then we come back and we say we're not going to do it again. Okay, I'm trying to shift.
Just zoom it a bit and then screw it out.
Zoom it a bit.
All right. So before we get to that, it appears that our spending structure has been quite visibly displayed as you as you took us through right now. But we'll still be hitting on that conversation shortly, because Bryce Simon has shown us how we've been spending from the year 1970 to 2005, that we have consistently been missing out with regards to how much we've made and also how much we've spent. And as of now, we saw that he made mention of the fact that we have the most unionized front in terms of labor across Africa, and that, in a way, has not helped us much. But we'll go back to the screens and listen to what more he has to share with us in regards to where we are. We are building up to a very serious conversation, so stay tuned as we go on here.
So when the government then decided that it was not going to do the IMF program, it started another type of restructuring. Usually the restructuring has been led by creditors, the World Bank, those that we owe money to, those that we are subservient to in a certain sense. This time onwards, the government started to come up with almost like a homegrown strategy for reform. A lot of it was basically making Ghana more creditworthy in the international markets, so we don't have to be dependent on bilateral creditors. Bilateral creditors meaning the UK, France, Germany, and the rest of it. The multilateral being World Bank, IMF, IFC, and the like. So the idea is that we can go and talk to the rest of the market, not just a few selected people that, for historically we've always been dealing with, or countries or players or actors or whatever. We could go talk to the rest of the market if we become more attractive as an FDI destination. So people are bringing their money to invest. We can borrow from commercial banks. So part of that journey led us to this. So when you look at this, what you find is that a lot of our debt is now no longer in the hands of the multilaterals, right? So the multilaterals have really, 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 really declined. Mm-hmm. A lot of our debt is now in the hands of the commercial sector. A lot of the debt is in the hands of non-resident investors who are buying our bonds and the like. When it comes to the bilaterals, it's about 10%. So money we get from France, Germany, the UK, the US, and the rest of it. That has really declined. When it comes to multilateral, we are around 16%. Mm-hmm. So almost the rest of our debt is generally now in commercial terms or given out on commercial terms.
What does that actually
higher
mean?
Interest rates.
Okay.
The primary thing is higher interest rate. The second issue is that no longer is anybody else looking over our shoulder. If you go and take money from the French, they will say, well, where is the policy that says this will bring some returns? And you have to go and explain to them. And don't forget that if you're dealing with them, it can be different in our environment because we have not yet built up the same degree of checks and balance in policy terms. So there's a lot of criticism of the government, but it's not really criticism of our policy. I'll give you an example. How often do you have people talking about pensions policy in Ghana on radio and they argue about the mechanics of pension policy or the mechanics of plans for food and jobs, the detail? Should we invest more in irrigation and mechanization instead of fertilizer? Should we make fertilizer more commercial? Have you ever heard that? It doesn't happen. So the debate in the domestic terrain is often not accountability driven on policy matters. There's a lot of politics, but that's not the same as policy, and that's the confusion a lot of people get. So they say, man, is not talking, because we are talking policy and nobody's listening. That is the issue. So what happens is when you're dealing with the multilaterals and the bilaterals, they push you on the policy. And then we say it's neocolonialism. And sometimes it's true, because you have all these young people, they come fresh out of university from Paris, they are telling our ministers what to do. It's not nice. But the alternative is to replace that with domestic accountability institutions. Media work more with think tanks, opposition party work more with activist groups, and demand accountability on policy. And there's very little of that. So what happens is that the government borrows money, but there isn't enough question of what you're going to use the money for. That's what happens when you move a lot more into commercial. The second thing that happens is that the interest goes up. You get it? So how you compare that is to look at other countries that are very highly indebted, like Burundi, very highly indebted. But if you see Burundi's indebtedness, most of it is to the World Bank. Most of it is to FDB, IMF, multilateral, Paris Club, which is a club of rich nations, right? So almost all of it is multilateral and bilateral. What does that mean? It means that they will take the same amount of debt, but they'll pay a tenth of what we will pay. And then you look at Kenya, which is much similar to it. Because you can say, okay, Burundi is poor. That is why they get those concessions. We are now lower middle income. Nobody will give you those concessions. It's not entirely true. Bilateral creditors like Britain, France, and the rest, they will give it to you, but you have to go and play the political game. What does Britain want? What does France want? And then we say, well, they will just neocolonize that. That's only if you are not smart enough. Singapore got a lot of resources from all over the world, but they maintained their independence. Malaysia. So the fact that you are dealing with the British, you are dealing with the IMF, you are dealing with the World Bank and the rest, doesn't mean you must necessarily succumb to neocolonialism. But in our country, there's a lot of that sense.
Where we also had to go by what the IMF said in regards to stopping employment and also halt unemployment and all that.
We'll come to that in a second.
Okay.
But I was trying to explain that when you look at Kenya, for instance, have you observed that almost as much as 65% of their debt is concessional, by which I mean lower interest.
Okay.
Right? Compared to us. You see? Multilateral, bilateral, compared to us, multilateral, bilateral. So that a lot of the explanation.
Looking at just the graphs being presented, I see more organized in terms of Kenya and Burundi, in their way of borrowing compared to us. So our debt structure doesn't really reflect what we see.
We have more expensive debt, but it also gives us the ability to spend the money how we like, more than they do. Because they still have a lot more. For instance, they get a lot of money from China, and China has its interest, which they have to accommodate somehow. But it's lower priced. It's lower priced. And then sometimes in having external stakeholders, if you know how to play your game well, can actually make you also more robust. The other point is that in 2006, remember that I told you that in 2006, we said we were not going to do the IMF program anymore under the MPP government. So the MPP generally doesn't like IMF. It's a historical thing. In the beginning, they were willing to talk to the IMF in the 70s. But since the Kufuor era, the MPP's posture has been that with the IMF and the rest, people will look over your shoulder and tell you too much what to do. And we want flexibility on how to spend the money. So we discovered something called the Eurobond. In 2003 or thereabouts, we went and asked for rating agencies to start to rate us. We started having those discussions. Not long thereafter, we had our first rating, international rating. Once that rating came in, we can go and borrow from international market players. Not necessarily World Bank, Britain, France, everybody in the world who has money and has a bank or can lend to us through some other fashion. And we became extremely addicted to one particular type of borrowing called the Eurobond. These are dollar-denominated bonds, but they are sold primarily in the European market, and therefore they are called the Eurobond, usually in London. So we go to London, we borrow a lot of money, we have a prospectus, we say we'll do this with this, we'll do this with it. But these guys are sitting in London. They don't come and sit here with us, they don't engage with civil society, they just give you the money, right? If you convince them that your prospectus is true, you say, look, when you give me the money, I'll build this train here, I'll build this railway network here, I'll do this, because that my economy will grow again, Ghana will get even richer, so you don't have to worry about the money, I can pay you back. And they've been using that to borrow huge amounts. Compared to our GDP, Ghana is the biggest Eurobond borrower in the world. You can see. Countries like Nigeria are nowhere, you see. Relative to our GDP, the burden of Eurobond we have is almost 8 times that of Nigeria. And there's no country in the world, no country in Africa that compares to how much enthusiastic we are about Eurobonds. So some of them may borrow more in total terms, but their economy is bigger, so they can absorb the shock, if there is a shock. We have a smaller economy. In the beginning, this was seen as a positive sign, because it meant that there was confidence in our economy. So in a lot of economic analysis, one thing that looks like another with a little bit of another lens on, it looks completely different. But the fact of the matter was that Ghana was seen as, at least that's the way we sold ourselves to the world. That's why I said it's a big Bamba thing, right? We saw ourselves as, the big boys in Africa. Look how much we can attract. It has a certain merit because it is true that people saw Ghana as a more marketable destination for financial deals of this nature. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we're doing that great, which is the issue. Anyway, so the other thing that we also began to do was to entrench the fact that we have an expensive state. Ghana is expensive to run. The way we design our economy, the way we design our institutions, the way our civil service operate, the way our public service operate, the way politicians spend money, all of it has made Ghana very, very expensive to run. One fascinating example, there are two big pressures on our economy now. How much we pay public servants, and the public servants includes everything from the police, the fire service, the nurses, all the way to the civil servants. The civil servants are not the majority. A lot of things the civil servants alone know. It's everybody that the government pays. And then when we look at the second issue that is really pressing us down is how much we pay for our debt. I've already discussed how much we pay for our debt in great detail. So I'm now discussing one other major factor, and that is how much we pay for public sector personnel or to public sector personnel. So you can see that here, Ghana pays the biggest chunk of its revenue to public sector workers. Compared to the average in Africa, compared to the average in rich countries, compared to the average in all countries. Ghana is huge. 36%, now actually 40%, compared to around 25% on average. What is interesting though is that we employ less. So you can see here that, the total number of paid employees in Ghana, the people that receive a monthly salary, wage labor. 26% of our population, 26% of them are employed by government in Ghana. As much as 30% is the usual case in Africa. You see what I mean by that?
So in actual terms, what does it reflect?
It means that we don't have enough nurses and lawyers, enough nurses, teachers, etc. as much as we would wish.
But yet the money and payment all
is
goes
higher.
to that. Oh, I see.
It's higher. And it's higher because of the way we've structured things. How many directors you have versus how many people are actually on the front line teaching. Somebody, look at the way we structured GES, right? Somebody's assistant director, this, and then they get to tell them, they just want more pay. What is the actual contribution to the classroom? What is the actual contribution to management? So a lot of inefficiencies in the way we structure things, which is meant that even though we give money in different places and random places, two things happen. One is that we can't hire enough, and then two, worse than that, everybody's angry that they're not being paid enough. It's just disorganized in the way that we've structured the public sector. And then we started to find out that, or rather, the lenders started to find out that all the stuff I'm talking about is actually the facts. A lot of these rosy pictures that we've been painting, it's not that clear. So they started to embed that in how much they lend to us.
Okay.
So if you look at how much they lend to us, you can see that the interest rate they charge us is far higher compared to other countries in the world, especially in the emerging markets and in the Africa region. Of course, rich countries will always be able to borrow for far less because they are rich. So everybody wants to lend to them. But if you compare it to our peers, other African countries, other emerging markets, you will see that historically, and this is from 2011 onwards, we are the green. We're paying more. What this means is very simple. It's the difference between what the richest countries get and what you get. The richest countries are considered so rich that it's almost a privilege for you to lend them money because they'll never default. So you take theirs as the base. What we get is now the difference, called the spread. So if you hear the spread, that's what it means. Now, our spread is so much higher than our peers. And you can see some of the specific numbers for some of the specific issuances that we issued. This one is 8.5% in dollar terms. If you add inflation, exchange rate differentials, and the rest to try and see what would it mean if the government was borrowing the same amount in Ghana, this would be in excess of 20%. So in essence, the government is borrowing in excess of 20% to get the money that it needs.
So that means internally, what does it reflect in terms of how much we're making? Because if we are borrowing externally to absolute 20%, as you said.
If you compare it to what would have cost us if we were borrowing locally.
Exactly.
Yeah. So it means that just as when we say, why should a business person pay 20%? It's too high, right? Because that same business person in Turkey will be paying maybe 5%. So if you are paying 20% in Ghana, it's too much. You cannot run business. You hear that all the time from AGI. The interest rates are too high. A government is supposed to be much more safer than these entities. So a government borrowing at the equivalent of maybe almost 20% even if it's in nominal terms, is crazy. So just like you can't run your business with like 30%, a government should be borrowing at that level. So that's one of the big issues.
What actually pushed that to that level?
It pushed us to that level because the lenders began to realize that actually we were more risky, or we were riskier than we were letting on. And, the more they look at your books, the more they look at how much of it you are borrowing, they were beginning to sense that, no, these people, they're a bit desperate. So we need to charge more. Right. And then the market, don't forget that this is debt that is sold on. And this, I don't want to dwell on the technicalities, but in essence, the way a bond is structured is that when I lend to you, I can sell the debt I've lent to you to somebody else who is now responsible for collecting it in a certain very crude way of describing it. So it's not just what I think of you, it's what the other person buying the debt from the first person who lent to you, what they also think. So the way that the market prices your debt, how much somebody is willing to charge to hold your debt, is a very good indicator of what you really are worth in terms of a credit worthiness point of view. So all of this was based on the notion that we thought with all this money coming in, we're going to reform the economy.
Before we come to yet the big transformation, as in what isn't happening, I would like to take our viewers through. Initially, we began discussing Ghana's debt history from 1970 to now, to 2017. We saw issues with regards to how much we've been paying in servicing public debt. And most of the key things Mr. Bright made mention, Mr. Simmons made mention, has to do with we having a huge public debt expenditure structure, which necessarily has influenced how much we pay. And also, the government in itself pays over 20% in repayment to external companies or institutions. And that is a very troubling instances. But let's take a break. When we come back, we're still with Mr. Bright here to go through Ghana's debt history structure and discuss more. So stay tuned. Welcome back to Bottomline Live on Metro TV. My name is Winston Taki. I'm here in the studio with Mr. Bright Simmons, who is the Vice President with Imani Africa. We'll be discussing Ghana's debt history, and also he's taking us through the historical aspect. Now we will be coming to the present, what is currently happening with regards to our nation, Ghana. Quite revelative information that he's giving us here. But let's go straight back to him. He's taking us through the presentation. So just stay tuned, listen, and watch. It's right.
So why were we so confident about all this borrowing? Why were people lending us all of this money? And why is it that every now and then, compared to other African countries, we get into trouble so regularly, and it's all about not being able to sustain our debt and all of that? A lot of that has been this belief that we are a very wealthy country, we are destined for greatness, somehow we are on the path to becoming a very important country in the world. It started all the way from Osagifo, even before Osagifo. That sense of national pride and the fact that we are on the path to doing something really great. The problem is that it's not reflecting in the reality to the extent that it will match that whole vision. You see, so when you look at 1950, this is how much of our money came from cocoa. So at that point, the story that, look, we can't rely on cocoa alone. We have much more potential. We have minerals, we have land, we have arable land, we have agricultural potential, etc. A lot of that was true in a sense, because if you look at it, cocoa in the 1950s was just too predominant in the economy, too dominant. And then over time, we managed to shift to as low as around 50% and 40% in the mid-70s and the rest. So other factors of production were becoming more dominant. Other sources of revenue become more dominant. The problem is that since cocoa became less important, and you can see that by the time we hit the 90s, after structural reform and the rest of it, cocoa was now around 20%, the total share of exports. By the time we hit the present, yes, cocoa is still around 20%, so it's similar to what it was in 1995. The difference, though, is that the other things that have come up to make cocoa less important are not that different from cocoa in the way they behave economically. So gold and oil. And when you add gold, oil, and cocoa, almost 90% of all the revenue we make externally is accounted for. What does that mean? It means that we've moved from a monocrop economy to a commodities-dependent economy. Still natural resources. Not much happening beyond natural resources.
Does that mean those particular aspects are quite reliable compared to others?
No, what it means is that the pace at which you're able to transform the economy is highly limited in many respects. One, you are dependent on international prices for these items. It's not based on, things that are particularly within your control. Secondly, the way that they get produced, if you think of gold, the technology component of it does not sit in Ghana. Even the top engineers, yes, though some of them may be Ghanaian, but a lot of the technology and the advancement in the technology is purely imported in. So by the time you've done producing the gold, you've not really added as much value as you could. And it does not have enough connections to the rest of your economy, the linkages to other sectors of the economy. It does not transform other types of scale profiles. So there's so many reasons why just being natural resource is a problem. That notwithstanding, we've kept this whole thing going about Ghana is on the verge of takeoff. We are on the path to Singapore, Malaysia. We've kept it in the way that we structure our policy making. So it may not be reflected on the ground, but we behave like that. And that is why when you look at 2021, for instance, there's something we call the gross financing needs. The gross financing needs is essentially what the government feels the public sector needs to run the country. And you have something in the region of almost 110 billion. So you say, for me to run Ghana, I need 110 billion Ghana cedis. You get the point? But the problem is that your taxes are just 56 billion. Right? You get other revenues in the form of royalties and other things that are not pure taxes, but are still money to the government, around 14%. You borrow some local money. And then you rely on foreigners to meet the rest. Then you encounter a crisis as we have now. And we say, okay, in 2022, how will you do things? And they say, you know what? Actually, I need 136 billion now. And I will raise 80 billion in tax. What is important in these two sets of charts is the fact that, one, the ambition has not been moderated. It's a sense as if we are magic. I'll still spend 136 billion.
The government said they will cut down their expenditure to that respect.
Well, they said they will cut 20%, but nobody knows how they will cut it. But they've costed this, right? So they must now tell us what you take off. On top of that, why are you going to get 80 billion of taxes from 56 billion to 80 billion? Is it going to just spring up like magic? And when you take that behavior into account, the way you analyze it to the point where you really understand what is going on is to compare it to other places. Mm-hmm. Because a lot of time they talk as if Ghana is an island. And it makes it very difficult to have a debate because what they'll do is that they go and compare it to some other government in Ghana's own history. So we're not really, it's like we're in this little cocoon and we're not understanding what is happening in Ghana because we don't have perspective. You should step back and have perspective. These are the countries that are rated worse than us. So we're complaining about the ratings, right? We're complaining about the ratings that Moody's and Fitch and the rest gave it to us. I chose a couple of countries that Fitch, Moody's, and the rest say are doing badly than we are doing. When you look at how much we spend of our revenue paying debt, paying back all this money that we are borrowing to spend as lavishly as we do, look at the gap between us and the next country, sorry. You see the problem. So you see that we've risen from about 10%, using about 10% of all our government revenue in 1990 to pay and service our debt, to nearly 40%. In fact, it's actually more than 40% right now. And yet still, Togo and all of these countries that are rated badly than us are spending far less. So once you get out of the Ghana bubble and you look at what other countries are doing, we are doing some very strange things in this country. And these are the absolute benchmarks. You should not be spending more than 40% of the exports you make servicing debt. Sorry, 15% servicing debt. And 80% servicing revenue. This is the kind of like the technocratic benchmark. The experts have sat down and said, if you were running an economy in our part of the world, emerging markets, frontier economies, try and keep your spending requirements within these limits.
So what do you make of the report that the president made at AU with regards to the rating agency?
I'll
Because
get there in a
consistently, he said that the
They are
rating
biased
has
against us,
affected
they don't understand what they're doing. I'll get to that in a second. But the point is that if the experts say that don't spend more than 15% of your, 18% of your revenue on debt, and you are spending 36% to 40% or more, there's a problem.
Okay.
Then we started getting noticed. So even the countries that are ranked the West, countries like Belize, DRC, and the rest, the rating agencies still see that even they are not spending as much of the economy paying and servicing their debt as we are. You see that gap. So we get to the two issues that you keep hinting at, whether it is about COVID and whether the rating agencies are somehow biased against us, and that has led to this current temporary crisis, which I don't believe is temporary, as I've already made known. You can see how our debt was being seen long before COVID. This is from 2015. You can see that already, compared to the average for other peer countries like Senegal, Cote d'Ivoire, and emerging markets, we were being seen as way riskier. So that is evident long before COVID. This has nothing to do with COVID, 2015 to today. And already we are diverging again. In fact, we are diverging so frighteningly, it's back to the crisis period when there was a change in government and the doomsday situation had led to a fall in confidence in the economy. The other thing is that it was so bad that globally it was significant, which is the other thing that we don't seem to get. This is the spreads worldwide and the spreads continentally. You can see that our spreads compared to Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, and everything was very high. And our situation as West performers were sovereign. West performance was a global
All
dynamic.
these were before COVID.
These were all before COVID. The question would then be, okay, maybe we did something particularly incredible during COVID, which we had to do, and which other places didn't have to do. That would be the only reason you can give that will make the COVID argument sound. If you look at how we spend on social spending, which therefore, if you have COVID, it will trigger because people are not working, you have to give them welfare. We are not even among the biggest in Africa in social spending. Compared to Kenya, Senegal, Rwanda, this IMF data, by the way. We are not even that big in social spending. And then when COVID hit, it reflected. We had to raise our spending a little bit more. But even so, compared to West Africa, compared to emerging markets, we're a bit higher than West Africa, but significantly lower than other emerging markets, and far lower than the Senegals, the Benin, the Ethiopians, the Kenyans, and the rest. So why didn't they have the same degree of problems we had, right? If you're not spending a lot in response to COVID, why are you saying that COVID is your big problem? And then when you look at the actual impact of COVID on our economy, this is Ghana, right? Mm-hmm. Economic growth slowed down to about 0.2%, which was significant because normally we get like 4% the rate. But look at how badly some people did. They had contraction. The economy became smaller.
For Angola, I see negative.
30%. The economy, they lost a third of the economy. You know, countries like the Seychelles and the rest of it, Mauritius and the rest, huge problems. So if these countries are not getting into trouble with the rating agencies and they are not almost defaulting on their debt, and then you can't make the argument that COVID is the problem. Because we see the effect of COVID on the country's GDP growth. These are numbers. These are not opinions. And then when we look at the total spending as a percentage of your economy, because you can't just look at absolutes, look at it compared to the economy. You find out that we are nowhere near Mauritius, right? Mauritius spent what? 30-something% to fight COVID of its whole GDP, right? Even Burkina Faso spent more than us. Senegal spent more than us. So you cannot make the argument that it's COVID because the numbers doesn't show that, one, you suffered enough from COVID, and that, two, you had to respond more aggressively than other countries. And then you say, okay, but the ratings...
Before you go to that, the ratings being biased, you've shown us the pictorial view of how much we spend compared to other African countries. But
And no, this is global. So
This
you are
is
looking at
global.
emerging markets. African countries is behind here.
interesting. And what do you make of the debate as in whether we should have accountability with regards to how much we spent during that period? Because the huge conversation consistently before Parliament, even before
It was not
the
what we
nation.
spent that was the issue. We received more than most other countries. We received $2 billion from the IMF. A lot of the other countries didn't get that much. If we go through the numbers, look at how much other countries got from the IMF, because of our relative size, we got a lot more money. And the World Bank has now disclosed that they gave us an additional $430 million that most people didn't know about. So we got a lot of money to help us with our response to COVID. So accountability is in respect of that. What did you use that money for? Because those were concessional, very low interest. Sometimes with a grace period of like 5 years, 10 years, and things like that. Right? But when it comes to how much we spent compared to others spent way more than we did.
So does that?
So there are two different arguments.
Does that drain the call by the finance minister that we should let's both go through the struggle as a nation and help the recovery process?
Well, there's nothing that they are spending now that is necessarily COVID. That's the point I'm trying to make. In 2020, 2021, when this was the case, they were already spending less than other African countries. Today, how much are they spending in contact tracing, free health care for sick people? We had one of the shortest lockdowns. Uganda closed schools for almost 2 years and was still paying teachers. There are countries in this region where they give food and other relief measures for a year. We tried it for 3 weeks and we got tired. You get the point? So the argument I'm making is that when it comes to spending, actually that's not where the issue was. We spend less. The issue was revenue that came because of COVID. Money that we assigned claiming is for COVID.
So COVID should rather have saved us,
Exactly.
looking at the real true picture that you painted.
That is where I'm directing towards.
Okay.
Of course, we had a big hit to tourism. They closed the hotels. But you have to look at the proportion of our economy that is tourism versus a country like Mauritius, Seychelles, Cape Verde, where they have like 20% of their proportion of the economy being tourism. And then the fact that in the same period that you had issues to do with airport closure and the rest, you are also not spending in some other areas because people were home. So you have to balance all of that. And then the hit, whatever the hit is, will reflect in your GDP. And I've proved to you, when we go here, that our GDP hit was limited, showing that COVID effect in Ghana was way limited. How much we had to lose as a result of GDP growth, foregone GDP growth, was much less than some other countries that really lost massively. Look at this side versus this side. You get it? So that is the argument I'm trying to make. And then when you take all that into account, reflect on the fact that we didn't spend as much, but we got a lot more money and the rest of it. COVID, while it was bad, cannot be blamed for structural problems that I've explained up to date. In terms of whether or not the ratings were biased, the evidence showed that the countries that historically have defaulted more tend to be the ones that struggle with ratings over time. It's not perfect, but it's generally the case. So given that Ghana, as I was showing you on throughout the chart, has gone back to credit and say, I can't pay. Every now and then I can't pay. Of course, if I'm lending you money, I will charge you more. And if I'm a rating agency, I'll be more careful what kind of ratings I give you. Because if I don't give you ratings that reflect your truth, and somebody lends money to you because of that, and you default, my methodology becomes less effective. So to give an example, Moody's left Mali, I think 2012. They dropped Mali from their ratings because they said they were, the situation was bad and they were not giving them the right responses in terms of what they intended to do. Very soon thereafter, Mali defaulted. So my point is that yes, they have their issues, the rating agencies, they are not saints, but you have to understand that it's based on numbers, and some of those numbers didn't look good before they downgraded us already. Which brings us to IMF very quickly. I think the issue with the IMF thing is a bit of a red herring, and I'll very quickly explain why.
Let me get this from you. Let me get your take on this. One of the responses with regards to the ratings that was given by the Ministry of Finance has to do with the presence of the country director of IMF in Ghana, who chaired the rating meeting. They said her tenure was quite short because she came in the office.
No, it wasn't the IMF director. It was the lead primary analyst.
Exactly.
They said that Moody's lead primary analyst there was a switchover. And because there was a switchover, the person didn't know enough about Ghana. She was just a new person. That doesn't make any sense because ratings are not determined only by the lead primary analyst. There is a committee That's the final voting. So the lead primary analyst will send some recommendations in the dossier. But the people that are on the committee were not new people. They were people that have known Ghana for many, many years. So that was not really something that you could hold a candle, could hold much water. The IMF issue is interesting because, first of all, we need to take into account that IMF packages are not one thing. There's a quick summary of the major types of IMF programs you could go into. The one that we usually will normally get is the ECF. That comes from the Poverty Reduction and Growth Trust. It's a different window they used to get the money to give out. The ECF, yes, has more conditions attached, but the conditions are generally related to whether or not you are reforming, so you don't come back again asking for more money. The others, for instance, the RCF, which a lot of countries have got now, often don't come with any conditionalities. In fact, you have to ask yourself, the government during COVID has taken $2 billion from IMF, right? So if the same government is complaining about IMF, it makes no sense. What were the conditions attached to that $2 billion? There was no conditions because of the nature of that package. So it's not automatic that if you go to IMF, you get conditionalities. But if your situation is bad, then yes, you don't get a good product. Some of their products are less stringent than others. So that's the real issue. But the bigger discussion is about the fact that are we going to stop borrowing or not? Because I showed you the numbers. How much the government insists on still having to borrow. Even with this 80 billion tax thing, it's still expected to borrow 50-something billion, right? Locally and internationally. So it will still borrow.
All right.
So if the government will still borrow, then the only thing we have to check is which borrowing is safer. This is the Eurobond that they normally go for. Today, even if they reform their immediate issues and they went back to Eurobond, they won't get less than 9%. If you went to IMF, the worst you could get is maybe 2%. So that's important. That's a huge difference. Secondly, if you go in there and you go and ensure that you've raised money at that 9% and you bring it in, there'll be less accountability. They will not force you to publish anything. IMF will force you to publish all that information. So people like you and I will have more insight. So the key point is that so long as the government will keep borrowing, we have to look at the cost differential between IMF and other options. That's the way to look at it, not whether or not you go to IMF or whether the IMF is good or that's not a debate. Will you keep borrowing? Then what is the options? You get domestic market borrowing. You will get Eurobond borrowing. Are they cheaper than IMF? The conditionality and those things too has to be benchmarked against what you lose in the interest rate. The second thing is
right. Mr. Simon. It seems the conversation is quite deeper than we anticipated, and most viewers watching us as of now are really looking up to us with regards to how the journey has been. Mr. Bryce Simmons has taken us through the journey, but let me assure you that the conversation still on bottom line with regards to Ghana's historical debt structure, what we have to do and what we need to do in order to come out of the situation. Currently, the debate has consistently been going on in the House of Parliament. Opposition and government in power are also talking or discussing with reference to where the nation is heading towards. Some are saying it's a tougher time ahead. Let's gear up. We've seen fuel prices. We've seen inflationary figures. We've seen all things going up. But whether we are anywhere near the light is something that will be continuing to bring you here on. So but let me assure you that there's going to be a part 2 of this particular conversation here with Mr. Bryce Simmons, the Vice President of Imani Ghana. We'll usually bring you next week that aspect where you're waiting to see here on Metro TV. That will be it for tonight. My name is Winston Taki. Don't miss next week's edition of Bottomline. Stay tuned.